Kim Park program for the study of the book is a cross-disciplinary initiative, and it's designed to bring together scholars, students, and any and all who are interested in learning more about the history of the book and the materiality of information, bringing them together. And what better place to do that than at the University of Chicago, where our programs, departments, institutes, and museums make possible hands-on research with materials as ancient as cuneiform tablets to as current as online games. And as you know, this is our week of inaugural activities, and we're delighted to have you here. We've had a great lineup all week long, including a tour of the exhibition, A Pressing Call, 500 Years of Women Printing. By the way, that closes tomorrow, so if you haven't had a chance to see it, do stick your head in before 5 p.m. tomorrow. Otherwise, it'll be we'll be turning it over at the exhibition gallery next week. We've had a panel on careers in rare books that was very well attended, and we've had lectures by noted scholars, including our own Adrian Johns yesterday, and today Zachary Lesser from the University of Pennsylvania. And if you haven't signed up for our mailing list, please do. There's a link on our website, and that's the way you can keep informed about all of the programs that we have in store going forward. We're really excited. I think this has been a very auspicious beginning, and we hope to carry forward with lots of exciting activities. I also forgot to mention, but did not forget about all week long we've had, thanks to Melina Avery and Ann Lindsay, a hands-on fundamentals of bookbinding workshop. And today I stopped by in the morning and saw the incredible work that is being done, and I was so sad that I didn't sign up for it myself. I hope I can get a place in the program next year when we do it. Thank you. But they already were, the little end bands were in place on many of the books, and it was really exciting to see that coming together. None of this, of course, would be possible if it weren't for Angela Wakowicz, who's a graduate student in English. Many of you know her, and she is the inaugural Kim Park Fellow, helping me. And I also wanted to just shout out to all of my colleagues in the library. Every single person has helped in some way or another, even poor John Kerry with my emails that I never used that red flag exclamation point until this week. Every message I sent him had a little exclamation point, so there's always some emergency in this very room. And of course, the program has been made possible by a very generous gift from Mr. Michael Kim and his partner, Kia Ong Park. And we thank them most sincerely. And now I'm going to turn it over to Eric, where he'll take the floor for quite a bit of time.
No. Do I need to hold this?
I
don't. The on button is on the bottom of the microphones. You just want to hit that, and then it should.
Just use this. Okay. Yeah, so you can hear me, right? Okay.
I just don't know how this is.
Because we're gonna need.
Most of the hour will be taken up with some. No. Okay. So should I take this?
You got it.
No, cut this. Okay.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I am a proud member of the advisory board for the new Kim Park program in the book, and I want to start by acknowledging the generous gift that Michael P. Kim and Kyung Ah Park have given the library and the university. As somebody who oversees undergraduate education in the arts and the humanities, I'm also extremely proud to acknowledge that their son is a proud graduate of the class of 2023 and earned honors in classics. Anyway, I want to thank them for the support of this really important endeavor. I also want to thank Catherine Eckert, the director of the Anna Holborn Gray Special Collections Research Center, Elizabeth Frengel, the curator of rare books and director of the new program, and Angela Wakowicz, the inaugural fellow of the new program, and my co-conspirator and curator in the colloquium series of which tonight's lecture is a part. As I said, I help oversee undergraduate education, and so I'm thrilled to see so many undergraduates leveraging the special collections for their educations. Catherine tells me that 2,500 students last year attended classes in that wonderful space. just west of here. I teach there as much as I can. She knows that. All too painfully, I think. But only 25 of those students, 1%, were my students. The University of Chicago has always been home to scholars interested in the production, transmission, and reception of texts. Today, faculty and students on our campus study a diverse range of textual and material objects and pursue multiple methodologies and themes across time and space, from the origins of writing to the development of new digital platforms, from the tablets of the ancient world to the tablets we now carry around in our pockets. We heard a fantastic talk last night from Adrian Johns that concluded with some of the past contributions Chicago faculty have made to the study of the book and especially the history of reading. And I just want to underline how exciting it will be, as he said, to bring together students and faculty from across a dozen departments in the humanities and social sciences, as well as our schools of divinity, law, and medicine, to explore shared interest in the material culture of information and communication. We are fortunate to have with us tonight one of the major players in the field of the history of the book in literary studies, Zachary Lesser, who is the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. Since 2019, he is also the director of the weekly seminar in material texts. When we thought about colleagues we'd love to have with us to help celebrate this new initiative, we knew we wanted to talk with and hear from Zach. I want to tell you a little bit about him, and then, in an institutionally aggrandizing way, I want to make a case for the impact of this university, which I believe he has never visited, on his work. Zach earned a BA at Brown and a PhD at Columbia. He's the author of a series of important book-length studies, Renaissance Drama and the Politics of Publication from 2004, the prize-winning Hamlet After Q1, published in 2016, and Ghosts, Holes, Rips, and Scrapes, Shakespeare in 1619, Bibliography, and The Longue Durée, published in 2021. That wonderful book is peopled with a cast of scholars and editors across a very long time. But one of the most significant, and I would think this, was a little-known American poet and scholar named William Neidig, who in 1910 used the system of composite photography pioneered by the inventor of the criminal mugshot, Alphonse Bertillon, to prove that the title pages of some mysterious Shakespeare quartos seemingly printed in 1600 and 1608 were in fact piracies produced in 1619. Like Bertillon's method, Lesser notes, Neidig's scientific analysis identified a criminal, the pirate Thomas Pavier. Neidig's view of this bibliographic fact nevertheless held sway for most of the 20th century. Neidig had been a graduate student at the University of Chicago around 1904, but he never took a degree. He wrote a book of poems instead, and when they were published in 1905, a new colleague at the University of Wisconsin at Madison sent a letter to the Swedish Academy to nominate the 25-year-old for a Nobel Prize in Literature. He lost to Rudyard Kipling. By how much, we don't actually know. Those records are sealed. Neidig had worked with the English department's chair, John Matthews Manley, to develop a special camera and device for comparing texts. And when an assistant professor named David Robinson brought back some high-definition photographs of the quartos from the British Museum, Neidig went to work. He spent, quote, some all-night sessions with the facsimiles at Chicago before reaching his conclusions. And when it came time to publish his findings, where else could he turn but to University of Chicago's journal Modern Philology, edited by Manley and published then, as now, by the University of Chicago Press. Lesser's book upends much of what we think we know about these quartos, including some of what Neidig told us, by drawing on over 300 surviving copies. Zach's own investigations were made possible by living curators and conservators, some of them in this city, including Jill Gage and Lisa Dowd at the Newberry Library. But I think it is fair to say that without Neidig's early analysis on our campus, his book would have told a very different story. Lesser is here today to talk about Macbeth, and I should say he is the general editor for the Arden Shakespeare, now in its 4th series, and is editing that play. He has also co-edited a series of important volumes of scholarship, including The Book in History and The Book as History, a series of articles published in 2016 in honor of David Scott Caston, one of Zach's graduate mentors. As some of you will no doubt know, Professor Caston earned his PhD here from the University of Chicago's English department before departing for Columbia and then ultimately to Yale. I think he retired from both places. Caston graduated from the University of Chicago 50 years ago in 1975. That same year, Anthony Grafton, one of the greatest practitioners of the history of the book, who had spent his career at Princeton, earned his PhD from the University of Chicago's Department of History. Any institution should be measured not simply by the faculty it attracts, but by the students it trains and sends out into the world. The fact that these two future heroes of the history of the book and of material text happen to overlap in Hyde Park is a further data point in the history of Chicago's contributions to the field. It is hard to imagine the institutional development of the study of the book in history and in literature without these two crucial figures, our alumni. And dare I say it, without Chicago, maybe there's no David Scott Caston, at least not the David Scott Caston we know. And without Caston, the engagement of the history of the book in literary studies would look very different. There would have been no U-Chicago trained advisor to prod his Columbia advisee with a so what kind of question, that is to ask why the history of the book should even matter to literary critics. So no Chicago, maybe no Caston, and perhaps then no Zachary Lesser. Or not the Lesser we know. A different Lesser, perhaps. Who can say if it's a lesser Lesser? I've gone on too long with these Chicago-centric reflections, and of course he doesn't owe everything to this place. But I hope I've made my case that the impact we have made over time has changed the course of his own work. And with that, I hope you will join me in welcoming Zach to the Kim Park Colloquium in the book for a talk entitled To the Wayward Sisters Again, 3 Editorial Rabbit Holes and 3 Witches in Macbeth.
Well, thank you. You didn't mention that other school a couple hours south of here where I have actually spent some time. That's fine. No, thank you for that introduction, and I also want to thank Elizabeth and Angela, and also Nolan Kishbaugh for making this visit possible. I also want to say it's an honor for me to follow Adrian Johns last night. His work, has been important to me since I first encountered it 27 years ago, I think, in graduate school. It had a real influence on me, and that fact, I think, in itself kind of stresses what he was saying last night about the infrastructural quality of this field. Since I'm in an English department, not a history department, my own training comes out of, I think, pretty different strands of the history of the book than his. But nonetheless, these kind of crossings that this field enables are very powerful, I think. And what I took, I was thinking about the talk last night, what I took most from it was Adrian's injunction to us to tell big picture stories in this field. That is, we've had several decades of critique of some of the kind of grand narratives, some would say technological, deterministic narratives that really dominated work in this field in the mid-century through the 70s and 80s. And that, maybe after that critique, we might productively return to some of those big pictures, with the lessons learned from that critique. And I agree with that, and I think you'll hear a kind of analogous dialectical movement in my talk today. But I do want to say that while I agree with that injunction, big picture, that is not what tonight is going to be about. This is like a small picture, minute picture. But my goal is to convince you that the minutiae might actually matter. Okay, so I'll begin with that and just say again that I'm really honored to be here as you inaugurate this this new program, the Kim Park program for the study of the book. As you heard at Penn, I now direct the workshop in the history of material text. That's the term we use. Again, thinking about last night, one of the points made was we have to think about the book as broadly as possible. So this is the term that Peter Stallybrass came up with for the field when he started this workshop in 1993. The workshop is housed in the Special Collections Library at Penn, the Kislak Center for Special Collections, and that has really been my intellectual home at Penn. I would say probably more than the English department, in fact. So I think that a program like this one can be an incredibly lively place, as it brings together faculty and students from different departments, librarians, curators, conservators, people in the book trade, book artists, in a communal study of books and their cultural impacts. And I do know you're building on a long history of work in this field, right here at the University of Chicago. We heard some of that last night. We certainly heard it a few minutes ago. But I also expect that this new program will open up new avenues and new collaborations. So I want to congratulate you on its foundation, and I'm happy to be part of its inaugural programming. So the history of the book, or material text, is, as you know, an expansive and capacious field. As we say on our About page for the workshop at Penn, we're interested in everything from scrolls, clay tablets, printed books, to e-readers, websites, and server farms, from woodcuts to PDFs, title pages, to listservs, and much else. But lately I've been immersed in one of the oldest strands of this field in early modern English literature, which is the critical editing of Shakespeare, which itself has a long and distinguished history here in Chicago, with my academic grandfather, David Bevington, among them. So today I want to talk about an issue that's come up repeatedly as I've been editing Macbeth: seeming errors of fact in the folio text. I'll begin with three relatively minor cases. The first two are very minor, and the third, I think, is somewhat minor. But even seemingly unimportant textual decisions that an editor makes can have significant effects on the meaning of a work. My students are shook, as they like to say, when I tell them that at numerous key moments in Shakespeare's plays, we simply don't know what word he wrote. I think this makes a difference even in these minor cases, but if I fail to convince you of this, with these examples, I turn in the latter part of my talk to a more obviously important and famous case of a word in Macbeth that does not accord with Shakespeare's source, where it may simply be a typo, and where an editor's choice will have serious ramifications for readers' understanding of the play as a whole. These errors can tell us something about editorial practice as well, beyond the cases at hand, since in some ways they resemble those Shakespeare plays that exist in both quarto and folio. As with plays like Hamlet or Lear, in these instances we have an alternative, a source or a historical text, against which we can check the text being edited. And more importantly, these examples get at a central question with which I believe any editor must begin. What are you editing for? What text are you trying to reconstruct? The author's intention for the work as it made its way to the public, through the mediation of other agents like publishers, editors, acting companies, something else? This gets at the fundamental question of what exactly editing is. So this talk has three sections. In their landmark essay that helped to launch the new textualism in bibliographic studies, Margrethe de Grazia and Peter Staley-Russ discuss the characters in Macbeth who have, since Louis Theobald's 1733 edition, been known as the Weird Sisters, but who are in F called either Wayward or Wayward. De Grazia and Staley-Russ use this example to emphasize the gap between early modern ideas of spelling and language and our own. The folio's Wayward and Wayward Sisters, and Holinshed's Chronicles' Weird Sisters belong not within the straitened confines of a later monologic orthography, but in a semantic field that accommodates verbal vagrancy. And we can see the congruence between this critical approach and the editorial approach, often called unediting, which sought to represent the early texts of Shakespeare while undoing centuries of editorial accretion. The new textualism was founded largely in a critique of the new bibliography, the 20th century bibliographic movement, that brought either new rigor or overconfidence, or both, depending on your position, to editing. Rejecting the new bibliographers' belief that they could, in Fretz and Bauer's phrase, strip the veil of print to infer Shakespeare's underlying manuscript, some new textualist scholars simply favored reproducing an early edition in facsimile. Others continued editing, but attempted to stick closer to the early texts, refusing to amend anything but the most obvious typographical errors. Thus, in 1992, Graham Holderness and Brian Lockery began the Shakespearean Original series, which presented very lightly edited texts of early quartos that had been, they said, modernized out of all recognition. The Cambridge series of the first quarto of various Shakespeare plays continues this tradition, though in a more editorially rigorous fashion. As I've argued elsewhere, however, for all its heuristic benefit to the field, this kind of single text editing, in which quarto and folio texts of the same play are treated entirely separately, ultimately offers a postmodern bibliography that yields fragmentation and heterogeneity at the expense of coherent historical explanation. With plays like Macbeth that were not printed in quarto before the first folio, we see in new textualist work a similarly insistent refusal to speculate about textual origins. But without a theory that can in some way associate the different texts of Hamlet or Lear or Midsummer Night's Dream, it's unclear what it even means to speak, as I just did, of quarto and folio texts of the same play. And without a theory of textual origins, even for folio-only plays like Macbeth, we're left without a rigorous basis for amending even the most seemingly obvious typos. How can we distinguish a typo that should be corrected from text resulting from some other underlying process? Such distinctions might seem simple enough when faced with AUD for and, a common enough typo, resulting from the U being accidentally redistributed into the N box in the compositor's case before being picked out again for resetting. Or even in this delightful case in F4, Claudius asks whether he could really pray, "Forgive me my foul mother," which an early reader of the copy now at Michigan State has corrected to murder. But without some theory of textual origins, which would tell us that F4 depends on the earlier folios for Hamlet, which all have murder here, why not consider this a possible variant and possibly valid reading? After all, forgiveness and foul mothers are very much on both Claudius's and Hamlet's minds throughout the play. Or more seriously, what about this famous crux in Othello? Does Othello compare himself to the base Indian who threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe, or to the base Judean? The word tribe was equally applicable in the period to Indians and Jews. Myths of native peoples who misunderstood economic value in commercial exchanges with Europeans were already circulating when Shakespeare wrote his play. Judas was the lone Judean among Jesus' disciples, and Jesus was the pearl of great price thrown away by Judas. The crux appears irresolvable, since both words work so well in context, and it may well result from exactly the same compositorial negligence as AUD for and, since Indian and Judean can be spelled identically, except for that term U. The movement from AUD, and, to foul mother, to a Shakespearean crux that has baffled editors for centuries is a difference merely of degree, not kind. Once you amend even the most obvious typo, it's hard to come up with a strict theoretical rationale for declining other emendation. And yet, to most readers, it makes a big difference whether Shakespeare wrote or Richard Burbage spoke the word Indian or the word Judean, and whichever word an editor chooses to print, or a modern director selects for performance, will transform the play for readers and spectators. I hope this example makes clear that, as I wrote in conclusion to my study of Q1 Hamlet, refusing the search for textual origins ultimately offers no solution to the problems posed by that search itself. There I compared the two textual stemmas, one more traditional and one unedited, in the Arden third series Hamlet, to the famous comparison that Frederick Jameson makes between Van Gogh's painting of peasants' shoes and Warhol's diamond dust shoes. With the postmodern image, Jameson writes, "There's no way to complete the hermeneutic gesture and restore to these oddments that whole larger lived context from which they emerge. The result is fragmentation and multiplicity at the cost of historical explanation. Likewise, the unedited theory of the text of Shakespeare cannot account for the historical context, author's manuscript, theatrical book, actor's role, printing house copy, compositor's stick, printing form, from which they emerge. Not to mention that on the most basic level, readers of a play and performers generally will want a single word at a single point, rather than a range of variants, despite the early dreams of hypertext editing. For reasons both theoretical and practical, therefore, we cannot avoid editing Shakespeare. So the Art in Shakespeare 4th series therefore envisions a return to editing, but one that incorporates the critique of new bibliography launched by the new textualism. What might this mean in practice? We ask each editor to reconstruct some early modern work, or a particular version of that work, the line between the two is blurry, the text of which will by its nature not be perfectly represented in any surviving material document. Unlike more traditional editorial projects, the Art in 2, for instance, this need not be the author's intentions. Nor need it be, as in the 1986 Oxford Shakespeare, the play is first performed. Editors may choose to reconstruct either of these, or indeed something else, such as the text of a revival, depending on the particularities of their play. So my own editorial goal for Macbeth is to reconstruct the text of the play as it was revived in the mid-16 teens, when it was almost certainly punched out with new material added by Thomas Middleton, including the two witch songs, Come Away Hecate and Black Spirits in White, which are cued in the first folio only by their first lines, but which appear in full in Middleton's play, The Witch. I'll turn now to my 3 minor rabbit holes to think through the question of how the choice of editorial goal can impact editorial decisions. The problem of what to do when there's an error of fact in a literary work has not received a lot of attention, but the great textual theorist and my old teacher, Tom Tanselle, has discussed it in an important essay. He has a nice Chicago connection too, but with the Newbery, since you'll see a bit of Melville soon. He was an editor for the Newbery Melville edition, the great edition of Melville. So in this essay, Tanselle is mainly concerned with quotation, or rather misquotation. Should an editor correct the text when an author seems to misquote a source text, as occurs often in the compendium of extracts about whales preceding Moby Dick? But he considers, alongside quotations, other related details such as references to actual geographical locations, specific historical figures, dates of real events, and so on. For instance, Melville gives a prefatory page with the word for whale in a number of languages, but the word he lists for the Icelandic is simply whale. And that's not right. But should an editor change it? Tanselle notes that one of Melville's sources includes, just preceding one of the quotations that Melville used elsewhere in the novel, the expression ill whale, bad whales, in which the first word is offered as the Icelandic and the parenthesis as the English translation. So perhaps Melville figured that removing the ill left the Icelandic word for whale. The source, further, is wrong about the Icelandic word. Tanselle argues that an editor might amend here, since Melville's intention, evident in the text, to provide correct facts, justifies the editor's going beyond Melville's knowledge to make the correction, so long as the error does not achieve a possible significance of its own within the text. For instance, if Melville had discussed in the novel the odd fact, not a fact, that English and Icelandic share the same word for whale. But Tanselle adds that one could argue against amending by saying that if Melville did indeed, on the basis of consulting an outside source, regard whale as the correct Icelandic word, whale is thus his intended form and should remain. Now, Tanselle is assuming that one is editing for authorial intention, which I'm not. Still, what I like about his essay is how it frames the editor's task and highlights the crucial importance of critical judgment in every case. Any mechanical rule of thumb for handling the amendable errors of external fact involves an abandonment of the editor's critical function. In each case, the editor must determine what decision will aid in the task of reconstructing the text, given the editorial goal that the editor has chosen. Perhaps an alteration of a place name or a quotation or a person's name is not in fact a mistake or typo or scribal error. Perhaps it was intended to be part of the text that the editor is reconstructing. Hence, to amend would be to move further away from that goal. For instance, many editors amend the name of the character known as Imogen in Cymbeline to Imogen, because that's how she's called in Holinshed's Chronicles, and Imogen as a name appears in the opening stage direction of Much Ado About Nothing, though the character never appears and is forgotten after this stage direction. So perhaps Imogen is a simple misreading of the double N for M. On the other hand, there are plenty of instances of Shakespeare changing a character's name from his source. And if this is a misreading or typo, it's one that's repeated about 50 times in the text of Cymbeline, if we include speech prefixes that are typically IMO. Neither the fact that the character is named Imogen in F, nor that she is named Imogen in the source, nor, if one is strict about sticking to one's editorial goal, that she's become widely known as Imogen, can mechanistically determine the editor's choice. There's a lot of kids I've encountered in the last 5 years or so named Imogen now. And I feel really bad if it turns out that their name is a typo. So the editor must consider the entire situation and make an educated guess at the reading that stood in the text of the work that's being reconstructed, whether that's the author's intended text or the first performance text, or as in my case, the text of a later revival. So my first example from Macbeth appears relatively straightforward and has generated near unanimity among editors, but it's a bit less straightforward when considered alongside my second example, I think. As Macbeth and Banquo enter for the first time, Banquo asks in F, how far is called to Sorus? And this is what Nicholas Rowe printed in the first modern edition in 1709. But his successor, Alexander Pope, amended Sorus to Forus, and nearly every editor has followed him. Holinshed places the scene in Forus, which has generally clinched the case for emendations. But Tanselle's argument, it's also true that if you Google the geography of Scotland, there's a place called Forus, and there's not a place called Sorus. But still, I think Tanselle's argument should cause us to pause and consider exactly why this seems to clinch the case. The fact that Forus is in Shakespeare's main source is important, but how can we know that Shakespeare didn't intend to change the name? Perhaps because Sorus sounded more poetic in a line that includes other sibilants. How far is called to Sorus? Of course, Forus provides a nice alliteration with far, so this is a good example of how, given the ingenuity of literary critics, arguments from poetic or literary qualities can typically cut both ways, and hence are often not as useful in editing as we might hope. More important, I think, is the fact that S and F are among the most frequently confused letters in secretary hand, and a common error in setting type from manuscript. Shakespeare was highly unlikely to misread Holinshed's printed capital F in Forus as an S, but the compositor working from the manuscript of Macbeth might very well make such an error, especially with an unfamiliar place name, where meaning could offer no guide to the correct letter. I suspect, therefore, that Forus stood in the manuscript copy of the play, just as it did in Holinshed, and that the change to Sorus is most likely a compositor's error, which ought therefore to be corrected, given my goal of reconstructing the text of the play, as it stood in the mid-16-teens revival. My second example can help clarify this thinking. On the same page of the folio, after the witches hail him as Thane of Glamis, Cawdor, and King, Macbeth comments, "By Sinel's death, I know I'm Thane of Glamis." Reading Holinshed, Shakespeare would have learned that King Malcolm II's daughter, Dolada, was married unto Sinel, the Thane of Glamis, by whom she had issue one Macbeth, a valiant gentleman. However, insofar as there is a real historical person involved, Macbeth's father's name seems to have been Finel with an F, not Sinel. This external fact can be found in Andrew of Winton's 14th century chronicle and in earlier accounts. For this reason, in his Cambridge edition, A.R. Bromweiler amends, noting, historically Finel, or Finley, or I'm not good at Scots, so I don't know.
It's Finley.
Finley.
My son is called Finley.
There you go. Historically, Finel or Finley was Macbeth's father, and that name should be substituted here, just as Forus is substituted for F. Sorus. F. Sinel's is an ancient error, the result of a long-ass F error in Holinshed, and in his source, the Dundee historian Hector Boyce. So Bromweiler's reasoning takes the two cases as symmetrical and adopts the same solution to both. It's true that the same FS error seems to be involved, and it's no accident that both cases involve this common substitution. The problem is that there's also a fundamental difference between them. In one, F aligns with Shakespeare's source, and in the other it diverges. Again, we need to keep in mind the textual transmission from print, Holinshed, to manuscript, Shakespeare's or some other scribes, and back to print, F, the folio. No reader of Holinshed would mistake the capital S in Sinnel for an F. And we can also assume by Occam's razor that Sinnel stood in the manuscript behind F. Macbeth, since that's how it appears in the folio. Otherwise, we'd need to imagine the compositor either accidentally misreading his copy and producing the very same reading that stood in Shakespeare's source, or else correcting his copy against Holinshed, neither of which seems at all likely. There's no likelihood of a textual error here, in other words, unlike in the Soros-Forrest case. Bronmüller's correction of F, then, is also a correction of Shakespeare's source text, and it's unclear on what basis he thinks he ought to make that correction. To do so is not to reconstruct Shakespeare's or Shakespeare and Middleton's intended text, nor, I think, is it to reconstruct the version that audiences would have seen on stage in Shakespeare's day. It's simply correcting a mistake based on historical facts. But as Tanselle writes, a factual error is not a slip if the author is copied accurately from an inaccurate source. To me, it's the difference between Soros and Sinnel that's instructive, not, as Bronmüller writes, their similarity. Together, they highlight that an editor's goal, if editing historically, should be to reconstruct a particular version of the text, not to correct and thus rewrite that version. Both of these cases can help us explore the third one I want to look at, the merciless MacDonald, as F calls him. In this case, it's very difficult to say what the historical fact of this character's name might be. According to Holinshed, MacDowald or MacDougald was the leader of a group of rebels in the Western Highlands, which makes sense given the proximity to the Western Isles and Ireland, where both Holinshed and Shakespeare tell us that he found assistance. Boece calls this character MacDoualdus, and so does George Buchanan in his 1582 Rerum Scoticarum Historia. John Leslie, however, calls him MacDonaldum in the accusative in his 1578 Latin history. William Davenant's restoration adaptation of the play calls him MacDonald, and the 1986 Oxford Shakespeare seems to have been the first to amend Shakespeare's text in this way. This edition popularized the merciless MacDonald more widely than had been known since Davenant's version held the stage. It's followed by the Arden Third series, the New Cambridge, the single-volume Oxford, the Norton, and others. So where does this leave us? Is Shakespeare's MacDonald a mistaken form of Holinshed's MacDowald? If so, should I amend to MacDowald much as I do to Forrest, but not Soros, since that's also in Holinshed? It seems that F's MacDonald was considered erroneous already by 1632 because the second folio has MacDonald, and F3 and 4 follow this reading. It's interesting that Boece is so close to Holinshed. In fact, Holinshed's form may simply be an alternate spelling of Boece's and pronounced identically, I think. MacDougald. And it's interesting that Shakespeare's name includes that medial N, which suggests MacDonald, but also includes Holinshed's medial W. I suspect that medial N is what led F2 to alter the name to MacDonald, clearly more familiar than MacDonald, and seemingly a variation of the name MacDonald chosen by Davenant. In modern Scotland, anyway, if Wikipedia is correct, both the MacDonalds and the MacDonalds trace their lineage to Clan Donald, traditionally styled Lord of the Isles, which accords well with Shakespeare's text, except that all of the clan stuff postdates the historical Macbeth by a couple hundred years. So a further wrench is thrown into the works by Malone, Edmund Malone, the great Shakespeare editor of the 18th century. His comment that Shakespeare might have got the name from Holinshed's account of the murder of King Duff by Donwald, another part of Holinshed that Shakespeare clearly read and had in mind, since it provides most of the key details for the murder of Duncan. If Malone's suggestion is correct, then we should not amend, since, as Tanselle writes, a factual error is not a slip if an author intentionally alters the facts. This might alone justify retaining F's form. What nags at me, though, is Holinshed's MacDowald and the corroboration in both Buchanan and Boece that this name could be spelled with a U in the middle. Minim errors involving U and N are even more common in reading secretary hand than F and S, and secretary W is a tricky letter, which can easily be mistaken for minims. I mean, if I didn't put the modern letters next to those, that W really, you could easily read that as an N. You could read all three of these as an man, right? So could the manuscript behind the folio of Macbeth have looked like this, or maybe even this? A perfectly reasonable variation of Holinshed's MacDonald, which the compositor might have transformed into the unusual MacDonald simply by turning that U upside down. If so, I might want to amend to Holinshed's form, since this situation would be analogous to the case of Saurus and Forrest. It's a compositor's misreading of what was in the manuscript. But Malone's suggestion gives me pause. If there's a reasonable suspicion that a word as it stands in F is correct, that is, that it accurately represents the version of the text I'm trying to reconstruct, then I want to keep it. All of which shows how risky it can be to look to the facts to amend the text. There are plenty of facts in the case of the merciless Macsomeon. The problem is deciding which facts matter. Okay, so by now you may not be convinced that these minor or minute textual questions really make a difference to our understanding of Macbeth. So let me turn in my last section to another case where F. Macbeth diverges from Holinshed, the witches. So the three witches in Macbeth are famously the Wayward Sisters, so famous that they appear as a rock band in the Harry Potter series. They give the title to one of the Discworld novels by Terry Pratchett, to a best-selling novel about an Ohio family, and to a film with a screenplay by Dylan Thomas about a Welsh mining village. And there's also a filk band from Atlanta named the Wayward Sisters. I had never heard this term before, but filk music is it sounds terrible. It's a mixing of folk and science fiction. So I guess there's songs about like aliens. And I'm sure there's a million more references to the Wayward Sisters, but they're not weird in the first folio. So here are the relevant passages from F1. The epithets for the witches divide in two, wayward and wayard. Are these two variations on the same word? Is one a typo for the other? And why is each repeated 3 times, unlike a typical compositorial error? Thinking bibliographically, excuse me, we can have some confidence that these are 2 variations of the same word because the division between them aligns with our best guess at the turns taken by the 2 compositors who set the play. Analysis of which compositor in the printing house set which pages of the first folio hinges on the distinctive and habitual spelling of some very common words like do and go, which might be spelled with or without an E on the end. According to the consensus among compositorial studies, compositor A consistently sets wayward and compositor B wayard. The fact that this distinction aligns perfectly with the generally accepted division between the 2 compositors of Macbeth suggests that like do or go, with or without the E, wayward and wayard are also 2 spellings of the same word in the manuscript that they were using to set the play in type. And in fact, these 2 spellings provide a good clue to the word as it appeared in the manuscript. The editorial principle of lectio difficilior suggests that the more difficult, that is, the more unusual reading is more likely to be correct. That is, to have been the reading in the underlying printer's copy. Because when faced with a confusing word, a compositor would be far more likely to assimilate it to something more familiar rather than something less. So I like this illustration of the principle that I found on the web. Imagine you're copy editing an article that discusses the Thatcherite politician Peter Carrington, Baron Carrington. In the article, his surname is spelled with 1 R, but the peerage title with 2. And you think, that must be a typo, right? So you search around online and you find a bunch of instances where both the name and title are spelled with 2 R's, but also a bunch where they're spelled differently, as in your article, which is correct. So lectio difficilior tells you that your article is correct as it stands. It's far more likely that people writing or copying the politician's full name would simply assume that both instances of Carrington should be spelled identically, than that they would repeatedly and accidentally spell them in 2 different ways in close proximity. So even without knowing the actual facts of the case, as we do here thanks to Wikipedia, the principle of lectio difficilior should lead us to choose the version with 2 different spellings of Carrington. By this principle, therefore, we might presume that compositor A created wayward, with an E as the first vowel, as a reasonable spelling of the familiar word wayward, with an A, out of the difficult graphemes he encountered in the manuscript underlying F. Wayward with an E is found elsewhere in the EBO TCP corpus, which is the main corpus we have of searchable early modern English texts. Not as commonly as wayward with an A, but not so rarely either. The word wayward, by contrast, appears in this corpus only in F. Macbeth. Therefore, once we accept that these are two compositors' attempts at setting the same underlying manuscript word, we can infer by this principle that the manuscript underlying F. Macbeth had the word wayward at all 6 moments. What conclusions can we draw from this evidence? The printer's copy for F. Macbeth has been generally thought to be a theatrical manuscript of some kind. But as Paul Werstein has shown, the distinction between authorial and theatrical manuscripts is difficult to maintain. Authorial manuscripts were frequently overwritten rather than recopied, and authorial markings that editors have tended to imagine would have been tidied up in the preparation of theatrical prompt books were in fact often left as is. So even if the copy for F is some kind of manuscript that's been worked up in the theater, it may well have preserved some of Shakespeare's own habits of writing. If we're interested in Shakespeare's authorial intentions, therefore, wayward is probably as close as we can come to discerning what he wrote. Wayward was apparently his phonetic way of spelling the word he found in Holinshed. The Weird, or the Wayward Sisters, or fairies. The Wayward Sisters, that is, as you would say, the goddesses of destiny, or else some nymphs or fairies. So how did F's words wayward and wayward become weird in modern editions? In his 1733 edition, Theobald explained that wayward meant perverse, forward, moody, obstinate, untractable, and that the witches would hardly adopt this epithet to themselves, as they do at 1:332. Tybalt is the derogatory name that Alexander Pope gives him in the Dunciad, so I try not to use it, but I slip. It's how I learned to call him. Theobald found weird not only in Holinshed, but also in Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside, and Heylyn's Cosmography, and concluded that the word wayward has obtained from the ignorance of the copyists who were not acquainted with the Scotch term. Theobald here uses a version of Lectio difficilior, imagining the copyists assimilating a less familiar term to a more familiar one. But he begins with another method I find less reliable, inferring the correct reading from the fictive content of the play. The witches, he reasons, would not call themselves wayward, since it's a pejorative term. But of course, we can think of numerous cases of someone adopting, revaluating, flaunting a pejorative term as their own. Since Theobald was attempting to reconstruct the text of as Shakespeare wrote it, his emendation was, I think, correct, but not entirely justified by his reasoning. And his spelling, which you frequently still see in modern editions with the umlaut over the I, served to indicate the pronunciation, which is dictated probably by the meter to be in 2 syllables, wayward. And that corresponds to the spelling used by compositor B. Theobald's point that this was a Scotch term is also correct. By the 1600s, the word, once common in England, it's the Anglo-Saxon word weird, persisted mainly in Scotland. Searching for weird in EBO TCP yields 46 relevant hits, and of these, 42 are Scottish in one way or another. That is, they're either written by a Scot or published in Scotland or treating a Scottish subject, or some combination of those. We can therefore see Shakespeare's choice of wayward to describe the witches as an important part of his exoticizing project for the play as a whole, depicting a Celtic periphery where uncanny events might seem to an English audience plausibly to occur. The Wayward Sisters enact at the linguistic level the same racializing discourse of otherness as does the play more broadly. This is a good example of why the study of textual transmission, of editing rather than unediting, matters. If we conclude that Shakespeare intended to write wayward, as I think we should, we gain a deeper understanding of the politics of Macbeth. The word wayward, compositor A's word, does not carry these same connotations, being, as Theobald knew, a common English rather than a specifically Scotch term. Wayward is not the only word that performs this function in Macbeth. Most obvious is thane, which appears only in Macbeth among Shakespeare's works. The technical term for a Scottish feudal lord has long been recognized as a distinctive part of the Scottish milieu of the play, but it's not been seen as part of a web of linguistic details that exoticize the locale for an English audience. Kerns and gallaglasses serve similarly as technical words that root the play in the Celtic periphery, whether Irish or Scottish. Along with these words, there are a number of less obvious examples, including that idiom, how far is called to forest, which I discussed earlier, instead of how far is it to forest. Macbeth's letter to his wife discusses missives from the king, and OED calls missive for a letter or message, originally chiefly Scottish. Just like feed, meaning to hire or employ, for a fee. I keep a servant feed. Lady Macbeth says that were Banquo not present at the feast, it would be all thing unbecoming, and all thing for completely is another Scotticism. And Macbeth attacks his servant as a cream-faced loon, meaning a scoundrel or rascal. And loon was very clearly recognized as a Scotticism in the period. Of its 68 appearances in Evo TCP, fully 2/3 of them are spoken by Scottish characters in plays, prose texts, or ballads, often written by English authors who are mocking Scots dialect and accent, as in these two plays. And there are a number of other words like these. So Shakespeare's use of these words lends additional support for the conclusion that his intended epithet for the play's witchy sisters was another word that he expected his audience to understand, or at least to feel, as part of this play's Scottish and Celtic ambiance, wayward. Over the course of Macbeth, Scottish barbarism is vanquished with the help of the English king, and Scottish customs, like the rank of thane, are replaced with English ones, earls, the first that ever Scotland in such an honor named, as Malcolm says in the last scene. In this context, we might recall Harriet's brief and true report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, where De Vries engravings explicitly parallel Native Americans with the ancient Picts, the ancestors of the Scots. One of these engravings shows a Pict brandishing his enemy's severed head, rather like Macduff at the end of Macbeth, to emphasize that they were savages who, when they hath overcome some of their enemies, did never fail to carry away their heads with them. While Theobald was not aware of this full linguistic context, he did correctly perceive weird as a Scotch term, and his argument for emendation was immediately successful with lasting impact, as can be seen on this color-coded spreadsheet of readings from selected editions, from the first folio through the Arden Third. Actually, I put the most recent Oxford on there too. You don't need to worry about all the details to see that flood of green, which results from Theobald's emendation. So it's taken up in 99.9% of all editions after him. And in fact, the power of his emendation can be seen in the fact that even the 1986 Oxford Shakespeare, with its explicit and revolutionary goal of reconstructing the earliest performed version, rather than the authorial manuscript, continued to modernize the word to weird. But in fact, if we're interested in the word as it was performed, and what audiences probably heard at performances of Macbeth throughout the 17th century, the best choice is wayward. So how can we tell what audiences heard at performances of Macbeth beyond the text of F itself? Here's where various non-authoritative editions of the play, typically ignored by editors since they're further from Shakespeare's hand, can help us. They all show a preference for wayward. 9 years after the first folio, the second folio changed the first of F's wayward readings to wayward and rejected the others by amending to wizard. The third folio of 1663 and the fourth of 1685 simply follow F2 in all of these moments. But F2's emendation suggests that someone in 1632, perhaps the compositor, or perhaps someone in the print shop marking up a copy of F1 to correct what seemed obvious errors throughout the book, was perplexed enough by the word wayward to change it in each case. Here's the principle of lectio difficilior in action again, with a strange word being assimilated to a more familiar one, either wayward or wizard. This is suggestive of early reception of the play, although it may simply point to printing house practice rather than stage tradition. We can get closer to stage practice with the 1674 quarto of William Davenant's adaptation of the play. Davenant changes the last two readings to Wayward Sisters, while emending F's wayward women in Act 3, Scene 1 to three sisters. So here too we see the rejection of wayward and the promotion of wayward. But now we can have more confidence that these words represent what was actually spoken on stage, at least by the Restoration, since Davenant's version was the only version of the play performed until David Garrick restored most of Shakespeare's text in 1744. Most interesting to me, though, is that whoever composed the argument that prefaces Davenant's edition seems to have been fully aware, half a century before Theobald, of the meaning of weird. There, in a passage taken virtually verbatim from Peter Heylyn's Cosmography, which is itself derived from Holinshed, we learn that Banquo and Macbeth were met by three fairy witches, weirds the Scots call them. Given the knowledge of the word displayed here, it's all the more striking that in the dialogue of the play itself, Davenant consistently calls the witches Wayward Sisters. The different parts of the edition, in other words, distinguish between what we might call the historical narrative of Macbeth in the argument and the dramatic narrative in the adaptation itself. Regardless of what the argument makes clear the witches really should have been called, it seems, they will be the Wayward Sisters in the play. Certainly by the Restoration, the phrase had stuck. The Challenge, or the Female War, from 1697, this is a kind of satirical book of characters, includes an extended theatrical metaphor in which a woman who reveals her face under her mask is compared to several Shakespearean characters. Up goes the curtain, and a very Sycorax stares us in the face, so frightful perhaps and ghastly that if Macbeth's playing, we're ready to take you for one of the witches, the Wayward Sisters. Charles Gilden's adaptation of Measure for Measure in 1700 interpolates Purcell and Tate's opera Dido and Aeneas, which is itself influenced by Macbeth, and both include a witch's song beginning, "Wayward sisters, you that fright the lonely traveler by night." Here's a 1676 copperplate engraving of one Mother Damnable, which calls her unmatched by Macbeth's wayward women's ring for cursing, scolding, fuming, flinging fire. Macbeth had made Wayward Sisters something of a catchphrase. The influence of that catchphrase can be seen in Restoration bilingual dictionaries that likewise suggest the phrase had become a simple synonym for witch. In French, the Wayward Sisters, or witches, les sorcières, and in Dutch, the Wayward Sisters, the heksen, kolen. Davenant was adapting Shakespeare's play 7 decades after it was first written, and so it's by no means obvious that his text represents what was performed in the 16 teens, when Middleton apparently got the play ready for revival in the form that underlies F. But I have found one earlier allusion, well before Davenant, which suggests that he was following well-established performance practice. Thomas Heywood and Richard Broom's 1634 play, The Late Lancashire Witches, draws on Macbeth and alludes to its witches satirically, when Winnie tells her bewitched mother Joan, "As I hope to be a lady, you look like one of the Scottish Wayward Sisters." The association of Scottish with Wayward Sisters makes clear the allusion is specifically to Shakespeare's play. Later, another character fears he's been bewitched because some 3 months since, I crossed a wayward woman who muttered a curse after him. Here, wayward is just a synonym. Wayward woman is a synonym for witch. All of this suggests, I think, that Shakespeare's use of wayward as an exotic word that could enhance the Scottish atmosphere of the play was not picked up in performance, where the word was domesticated to wayward. In the print shop, compositor B seems to have followed his manuscript copy closely and produced wayward, but compositor A turned the word into wayward. Perhaps compositor A had seen the play in the theater. Perhaps compositor B was Scottish. Confronted with the wayward crux in F, editors since Theobald have turned to an external fact, in Tanselle's terms, the word as it stood in Shakespeare's source, and thus the actual word that must be represented by F's 2 variant spellings. But the question of whether Theobald's emendation must be embraced, as he put it in 1733, is more complex than editors have generally acknowledged. As I mentioned at the outset, this question relates to a more fundamental one. What are we editing for? What's the editorial goal? As Tanselle argues, no mechanical rule can be applied to cover all cases of what appear to be errors of external fact. With this variant, an edition that seeks to reconstruct Shakespeare's intentions should print Weird Sisters, as virtually every edition to date has done. Here we have the benefit of a source text that together with some traditional textual analysis, can correct what appears to be a compositor's error, as in the case of some of the quotations prefacing Moby Dick that Tanselle highlights, or the case of Forrest for Saurus in F. But an edition like mine that attempts to reconstruct the version of Macbeth as it was performed in the early 17th century, almost certainly by the time that Heywood and Broome wrote Late Lancashire Witches, and I suspect by the time that Middleton's Songs from the Witch were added to the 16 Teens revival that underlies F, an edition that wants to reconstruct this performance version of the play, as it was evolving in the King's Men's repertory, should choose to print Wayward Sisters at all 6 moments. So I'm curious to hear what you think I should do in each of these 4 cases. I think they show the continuing importance of editing after the unediting movement that's been so influential in Shakespeare textual studies and more broadly over the past 30 years. In their variety, I think these examples illustrate that having an external source or fact is unfortunately not likely to offer a shortcut through the thickets of editorial theorizing needed to establish the text. But of course, shortcuts spoil all the fun anyway. Thank you.